Hey, it's Dr. Parikh, and we are in a very exciting time. This is where your study gets designed. This is the room where it happens, the methods section. So you've already picked a research question, you know what you're going to ask, but there's a million different ways to ask it. There's a million different groups you can ask. There's a ton of decisions to be made, and this is the place and time where you make it. One more reminder that it is important that you do something that's manageable and fulfills the purpose of the assignment. I can only grade you based on what my rubric is, not based on what a cool, fascinating idea you came up with. So it's good to go simple, but it's still fun. You're still designing how would you study this, even if you were limited to a really simple approach. So the methods section is broken down into 3 different subsections. You probably have noticed from reading articles that not all articles have gotten this memo. Part of it is each article has slightly different requirements. Like I showed you, one of the measures I used, I got from an article that was doing this weird but good, high quality, random, they really attempted as much as they could to a random sample using a census approach. And so they spent a lot of their methods section talking about that census approach and didn't actually tell us about who was in the study until we got to the results section. So sometimes articles don't follow this, but it's important to know that this is the ideal. This is what's most common. So the 3 sections are participants, measures, and or materials, and procedure. So first is participants, and I have you get pretty detailed because in part, I want to hold you to a nice high standard. In part, I want it to be consistent so that I can grade everyone the same. Because your study is not the same as your group member study, but I need to be able to grade you both by the same yardstick in this class. So I have you all give me the same information. If there's ever something where you're like, I have no idea how this can apply to my study, and it doesn't seem like I've said anything about it, like maybe not applying to your study, just shoot me an email or come meet with me. It really, and that's one of the benefits of when you work ahead a little bit, is you have time to ask me these questions. So you're going to tell me how many people you plan to use. We use the word participants, not subjects. Suchman and the manual both talk about that. I'll let you hear it from them. How old they are. Make sure that you follow guidelines in the APA manual about talking about age groups. We don't use words like elderly. We don't even really use senior citizens. We use older adults. You want to use the format as much as possible, like aged blank to blank years. You want to talk about the sex, unless you are specifically talking about gender identity. I want to see you use the word sex, which refers to biological sex. So 50 women and 50 men. You're going to talk about the race and ethnicity, and I just did something I probably didn't want to do. And you want to include labels. You can just kind of copy the labels I've used. That's fine, because I've tried to do something reasonably broad. It's really tough to do this well. A lot of people will just use whatever the census uses, because they can kind of say, well, I used it because the census used it next. They picked it out. And then you're going to pick, so here's where you get to make another choice. You get to choose how many people, their age range. You get to choose if you care about men and women. If you don't really care, it's nice to say 50% men and 50% women. And you want to, but here you get to choose any 2 demographic factors you want. And I give you several examples. When you discuss them, you need to list the labels, and this is true for race and ethnicity also. And so you may say, I will, or you won't use I, but to say other demographic factors will include marital status, and then you need to list them, and the labels themselves get italicized. So the variable is regular text, and then in parentheses you have the labels. Income level. And I said it would be in $10,000 increments to 0 to 10,000. So the first one would be 0 to 10,000, and then up to more than 150,000. You can choose whatever demographics within reason you want for that. Have a rationale. Be able to tell me why you picked those. But you have a lot of flexibility. And then say how you're actually going to measure it. So not just marital status, but marital status, and then the labels, the options you're going to give to your participants. And you can look at your studies, at your articles, to see what other people are doing. You're going to say how you're going to recruit people. And remember, you're going to have to critique your study on bias. And so as you're choosing your recruitment method, try to limit the bias somewhat, but think about, already have in mind, okay, if I'm choosing, if I'm doing an email distribution, then that's only people who have email addresses, which is not quite 100% of the population. And that may be more problematic for some things than others. If you're calling home phones, very few people have home phone numbers anymore, so that's a really limited sample. And then you'll mention inclusion criteria, so that's kind of what you've already described. It's whatever people have to meet to be able to be in your study. Incentives, so this is what are you giving people to be in your study? And later you'll have to say exactly how you're giving that to them. Group divisions, particularly let's say you're seeing if men and women are different, or if older and younger people, or people with a history of anxiety disorders. If you are dividing them based on this demographic information, tell me that now. So group divisions. And you can see I actually made a boo-boo because I said gender down here, even though I said sex earlier. And again, unless you're specifically talking about gender roles, I prefer that you use the term sex to refer to kind of make that distinction. Possible group differences. So if you are dividing groups based on demographics, if you're not using a random assignment, so if you're looking at men versus women, I want you to also think what might be different. And you need to, this kind of works backwards because then you need to measure those things. So what are some other things you think might, make a difference that would be important? So I thought maybe men and women would be different ages, and I also thought they might be different marital statuses. And then attrition is another word for dropout. So think about what are some reasons that people might drop out of your study. For example, I took part in a medical study once, a nutrition study, and I kept getting really bad migraines, including nausea, after I would participate in the study. And so it happened once, and I slogged through because I was a very broke grad student and cared a lot about the minimal amount of money they were giving me, which is actually potentially coercive, that I was willing to keep going back to a study that made me so sick. That's one of the reasons I will tell you don't use huge incentives, because it's unethical if people feel like they can't walk away. But the second time it happened, I said, okay, this is just too much. I can't keep doing this. And so I did drop out of the study. So you can think about, people, if you're tracking people over time, they might move, and that might be a problem. Now we're on, so that's the participants. That's a lot of information. You're giving really detailed information, and probably none of your studies included quite all of that information. But again, I mean this to be really comprehensive, to be kind of best case scenario, and I want to be able to grade everybody consistently. So I tried to think of what anybody might need for their study. Measures, you've already completed a measures template. And so you've already done the bullet points on this, and you're just going to put them all together here. And so you're going to actually write out the paragraph for this template, because again, you've already done the outlining work, and I want you to try your hand at putting it all together. And so you're going to get it. Let me show you what that document looks like. So this is what you've already put together, and you're just going to take all of that information and put it on here. Or not necessarily quite all of the information. For example, I don't list what language it's in. And you can check the rubric to see what I'm really looking for, what I'm scoring you based on. If you're focused on a language other than English, you definitely do want to mention that. But if you're English language, that's kind of to be assumed. Procedure. So this is now where you say, what will the person experience from the moment they start interacting with the study to the moment they are completely done with this study, step by step. So it's going to seem to repeat and use some of the other information, but it's different. So first, starting with what is the very first they will find out about this study? How do they find out about it? How do they tell you that they're interested in participating? You need to mention informed consent. You may not have heard too much about informed consent yet in your classes. You'll definitely get a lot of it in experimental psych, but it's basically where we tell people from the beginning what they're going to have to do in this study. And we let them decide if they're willing to keep moving forward with the study or not. We also tell them their rights as a participant, including the idea that they have the right to stop participating at any time without penalty. So I need to see you. You can just do one sentence for this. That's fine. I need you to use clearly the words informed consent to get points, though. Inclusion criteria, so who's going to be included. Experimental and control groups. So if you are randomly assigning people, tell me that. But if you are comparing like men and women or citizens of different countries, whatever you're comparing, you can, if you're doing something like that, it's not experimental, you don't have a control group, so you can just say none. Similar, experimental manipulation. If you're not doing an experiment, you can say none. So in the participant section, there's some information for the people who are using a demographic factor to divide people. Down here in the procedure, there's another section for people who are doing the other thing, who are using random assignment and experimental manipulation. An experimental, you could say, it'll be drawn out of a hat. So they'll draw one of two groups. And so that, once you get a big enough sample, that should divide people evenly. So questionnaire access, it's kind of a weird term, but it's basically how are they actually going to take this thing? Are they going to take it paper and pencil? Is it an interview they need to complete with some sort of clinician? Is it something they'll get emailed? Is it an online survey that they'll get through their email? You need to tell me what order they're taking things in. Order matters because let's say you're asking about their anxiety about doing math. If you ask about their anxiety first and then have them do some math, their anxiety may not tell you much about how they respond to math problems. You kind of need to have them do the math problems first, or at least think about the math problems before you before you measure their anxiety. On the other hand, if you're trying to get a baseline measure, so you're trying to compare anxiety before and after, you may not want to, you have to be careful about how you talk about the math problems along the way. You may bias later questions. Often it's good to do demographics right at the end because there's been some evidence that even things like having people mark their race or their sex on a test before they take the test can bring up what's called stereotype threat. So for example, there's a stereotype that girls aren't very good at math. And so if you have girls mark whether they're a girl or boy at the beginning of a math test, we find on average their scores go down a little bit. And so we think that's because it kind of reminds them, oh yeah, this is something that people don't really expect me to do well on because I'm a girl. And so even though that might not happen for every individual, we know that it can happen in groups on average. And so you want to be careful. So demographics are good to put at the very end. You'll also want to remind us of all the demographics you're going to gather. You don't have to do the whole label thing because you've already done that. That information is in the participants section for me to find, but just mention, they will complete a form that asks about this, 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 and this. They being the participants. Remember, all of this is prospective, so they will do this, and then they will do this next thing. Debriefing. So just like you need to do informed consent at the beginning, you need to do debriefing at the end. You need to explain to them what the study was about, ask them if they have any questions, and give them an opportunity to access their data if they want to. So for example, if you give me a personality test as part of a research experiment, I, as a participant, have the right to ask you to give me the results of that personality test. So you need to basically say how they can contact you afterward. And then the last is, again, another ethical thing. Say something about how you're going to keep the data private. And you can see some examples of that in, let me see real quick where that is. method draft. I'm guessing I have. Yeah, so you can see examples of every section here in the method draft. So you can see how I actually implemented it based on a measure that I'm actually using in another study in real life. So it's pretty straightforward. You just need to say that like their names will not be associated with their data. So those are the parts of the method section. This takes a lot of attention to detail, but it's not truly difficult. And it's kind of fun. Again, this is probably not your dream experiment. This is not, what you thought you would be doing when you started this class or when you decided to go into psychology. But it's training wheels. It's structured. It helps you understand the parts of the process, and most importantly, it gives you something to write about. So have fun creating your little lab experiment. Bye.